In my circle of friends, we grew up during the rise of technology's dominance in entertainment. The mid to late 90s brought with it astonishing advancements in filmmaking effects, including one of my all-time favorite movies, Jurassic Park. The way that film incorporated groundbreaking computer-generated imagery by weaving it into scenes alongside amazing practical animatronics presented a never-before-seen illusion. It's a prime example of that ever-rare type of movie magic that still holds up to this day, blew me away as a kid, and is one of those sparks that helps define how you look at things at such an early age. Similarly, had I known about and played the original Star Fox on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System for myself back in the mid-90s, before Star Fox 64 and the advent of the PlayStation and Nintendo 64 pioneering 3D graphics properly, my mind would have been similarly blown to pieces. A brief summary on my thoughts before diving into the Super NES games. Star Fox was always one of those series I find personally fascinating, both in terms of its legacy and impact on the industry as a whole, alongside its status as a sort of B-tier Nintendo franchise. On the one hand, its first half of releases are known for pushing the technological boundaries of their hardware, and in the third game's case, helping to implement a now basic feature in most console controllers, alongside becoming the frequently cited fan favorite and spawning many legendary gaming quotes. On the other, it's also a series that is mostly known and oftentimes liked only for its third and most popular title. It itself both an enhanced remake, and was later remade itself twice in different capacities, while later games in its back half of releases have been somewhat polarizing to say the least. For now, I'll simply be focusing largely on the original Super NES game and its previously unreleased sequel on the Super NES Classic Novelty console. Full discussion on 20-plus-year-old games will follow, so a spoiler warning is in effect if somehow someone doesn't want to know the plot and gameplay details that eventually all more or less made their way into future titles in some way or fashion, and were largely done better there. I am thorough, if anything. Most anyone familiar with Star Fox likely knows the basic plot, but as it is the original game, I'll pretend nobody does. Star Fox takes place in the Lylat system, apparently located in the Milky Way galaxy, filled with anthropomorphic animals in various sci-fi and video game-themed planets. The fourth planet of the Lylat system, Corneria, was once home to the brilliant scientist Dr. Andros, before years of experimentation and arrogance turned him into a mad scientist that was banished from conducting his experiments in the heart of Corneria. In the present, he re-emerges as Emperor Andros on Venom, first planet of the Lylat system, and declares war. Director General Pepper enlists the Star Fox team to combat the simian threat in experimental R-Wing fighters to help free Lylat from the war it finds itself in. This base structure is used in the more well-known reboot Star Fox 64, its Nintendo 3DS remake, and the later reimagining Star Fox Zero. A lot of care went into the lore and universe of Star Fox than most other Nintendo properties of the time, and I do have a soft spot for sci-fi in general, so the plot does its job decently enough to give us a 3D shooter on the Super NES. Nothing amazingly groundbreaking in story, but it is a solid gameplay core for the rest of the series to pull from. As I initially stated, Star Fox would have been one of those games a 7-year-old me would have raved about endlessly to my friends and classmates on the playground. Even playing it for the first time within the last few weeks has me admiring the technological wizardry being accomplished on the Super NES, especially for a game initially released in 1993, right in the middle of its 4th generation run. The game mostly consists of basic origami-styled polygons, similar to what 3D games of the future Nintendo DS and to an extent the 3DS handhelds would be known for, albeit in higher detail. Still, it's technically impressive, and there were scenes that looked pretty neat for me even in 2017. This is largely in part to the game's sense of space, as decent use of particle effects and scaling help keep the illusion of constant forward momentum in the player's focus. That being said, Star Fox isn't a real looker by any means today. While it did help popularize the use of three-dimensional polygons for home consoles, and was Nintendo's first game to use polygons, I wouldn't exactly call it one of the best-looking games on the system. Call me old-fashioned, but the fourth generation of gaming that the SNES and Sega Genesis occupied carry some of the most timeless-looking video games thanks in no small part to the excellent sprite work on display during the majority of the 90s. But being the prettiest game on the block wasn't the main intention of Star Fox. Instead, having the game running this type of 3D graphics on a home console was, and remains, an achievement in and of itself. The novelty of an arcade-based space shooter that successfully recreated the illusion of 3D space is something I can appreciate when comparing it to other games on the SNES Classic here. It helps make Star Fox and its sequel stand out among the other juggernauts of the time. Still, the game is by no means ugly. Its simple use of color and distinct geometric shapes gives this game a sort of early 3D charm that makes me smile at the distinct attempt, similar to Final Fantasy VII's chibi origami figures. It's amazing that a few gray polygons with dual blue triangles helped create the iconic silhouette of the R-Wing, the series' staple super high-performance combat fighter. It may resemble a paper airplane with blue triangles for engines, but that's the sort of iconography I live for. So far, I've mainly discussed the presentation over the gameplay, as the visuals were a strong point in the game's marketing and identity. As my friends and family can attest to, though, pretty graphics does not a great game make for me. I find the aesthetic charming and recognizable to someone like me who has played every other entry in the series, and care more about art style and iconography over pure technical horsepower. No disrespect to the Super FX chip that brought the game to life though, as the gameplay would have been fundamentally different without that groundbreaking chip. As I alluded to before, I find what Star Fox did with its technology more impressive than how it looked, relatively speaking. Beyond the initial wow factor of seeing a 3D game on a Super NES, the basic gameplay for the franchise is alive and well in this first installment. Star Fox is an arcade-style on-rail shooter, constantly pushing the player forward down various levels and grading their performance along the way. Stages alternate being played from a third-person view and the cockpit, though this can mostly be toggled at will from the player by pressing select. One of its unique features that's somewhat carried over into its first reboot is how Star Fox handles difficulty. Players can select one of 3 paths to choose from on their way to Venom, Course 1 being the easiest and Course 3 being the hardest. This not only determines what planets are visited in a playthrough, but also changes the stages themselves on repeat planets like Corneria and Venom. This does a lot to incentivize multiple playthroughs, though I will highly recommend starting on Course 1 for a few technological reasons I experienced. It is true that the first path is pretty easy, as expected. Enemies aren't as aggressive, and the courses don't throw as many obstacles at you compared to the other 2 paths. I still recommend beginning easy though, because at least for me, I had to adjust to how Star Fox operates in terms of control and presentation for something that's evident in the video by now. I personally am susceptible to frame rates and can handle most any presentation as long as the gameplay remains smooth. There are exceptions, of course. If I wasn't kinda proud about my adaptability as a gamer, I wouldn't be able to go back and play early 3D and HD games during the N64, PS1, and PS360 era of very choppy frame rates. As you can obviously see, the frame rate of Star Fox chugs at a pretty amazingly low level, somewhat understandable given it's an SNES rendering 3D polygons where it normally couldn't achieve such a feat. While I was able to eventually acclimate to a frame rate that can be charitably described as an origami slideshow in slow motion, as someone who often fancies a smooth performance over cutting-edge visuals in action-based games, it took me most of my initial Course 1 run to downgrade back to the Nintendo 64 levels of slowdown. I'm making a bigger deal of this simply because even though I was aware and happy that barrel rolling was intact, or rather introduced, in this first game, in practice I was honestly unaware that they retain the ability to reflect low-level lasers. Not simply because there is no obvious indicator like in the later games that have added protection via a momentary blue shield. Rather, the frame rate can drop into the low teens in busier battles, often enough that my double taps of the shoulder buttons sometimes wouldn't even register. This made me naively think that the deflector shield from rolls was implemented in either Star Fox 2 or Star Fox 64. In fact, I was so accustomed to just tanking some busy dogfights in Star Fox 2 that I was genuinely shocked to learn that they did in fact work against a specific type of otherwise challenging boss fight later on, but I'll return to that. I know your team gives that advice as you play, but the response from me was so laggy that I did stupidly think that it was only to show off that you could just simply do a barrel roll. And I know how ridiculous that is, especially to a Nintendo fan like me, who did assume barrel rolls would do just that. I don't know, I know I'm making a bigger deal about this than almost anyone else would have any right to, but I had to immortalize my stupidity on this aspect of gameplay that I've known for 20 freaking years. Some Star Fox fan I am. Wow, that was a tangent. Anyways, frame rate equals 1. Okay, the easy route is still my initial suggestion, for the previously mentioned frame rate thing. While I can adapt to older games like this when I focus, this can be a big deal breaker for many, and I don't blame anyone for not being able to get into these SNES games due to the slower controls. Thus, the easiest path will let you get used to how the game plays and what type of reaction times are needed to play by these rules. Star Fox is framed like many Nintendo games. Gameplay is king, and other details like plot are all framed around this. For this game, your on-rails forward propulsion is explained away as your R-Wing's autopilot, and keeping you on a beeline to the course's boss encounter to end the threat and complete your current mission. Heck, the iconic blue triangles on the R-Wings are called the booster and retro rockets here, more commonly known in universe later as the gravity diffuser system, made famous in Star Fox 64. Fun fact, the G diffuser system debuted in SNES launch title F-Zero, one of Nintendo's other regularly put on hiatus sci-fi series. These rockets are used for limited boosting and braking options, mostly to avoid obstacles or chasing a fast enemy, though I think I made a couple encounters much harder on myself later in the game. One boss fight had me ahead of it for half the match, and it got me killed twice as I was trying to brake enough to hang back and actually deal some damage. Thank you, save states. I've only fought it the one time, so I'm not sure if that is intentional or if my haste and gameplay style simply got me in an unintended situation. This happens to me a lot in some games, so I had to mention it here and acknowledge that I can be stubborn if I'm aiming for a specific strategy or playstyle. Otherwise, the gameplay is pretty basic arcadey fun. Sluggishness aside, this is still Star Fox at its most base form. You shoot down various geometrically shaped enemies with lasers, charging forward until you reach the Alien Force Commander. Along the way, you can fly through and shoot various rings and foes to grant different bonuses, such as restoring your health, shields in this case, upgrading your lasers into twin blasters, repairing damaged wings via gyro wings, and collecting more Nova Bombs for when you don't want to aim. Solid stuff. The hitboxes on your R-Wings was something I was impressed with in Star Fox 64, and it is present here, which mildly impressed me still. As a kid, I would have been very impressed, but hey. Slamming into any object with the body of the ship will damage you greatly, but only clipping things with your wings appropriately damages only them instead and does half damage to your overall shields. This will cause you to lose your twin blasters if any of your wings are destroyed mid-mission, so solid incentive is in place if you want to deal damage efficiently. You can also find a power shield that can grant you temporary invincibility. It gives you a semi-neat wireframe effect, and you can tank a few hits before it reverts and you become a mortal fantastic flying fox again. The stages themselves are what you'd expect from an extremely early 3D console game, meaning don't expect anything terribly detailed. This is where atmosphere and enemy variety have to prop up the variance in environments. This isn't as much of an issue when doing a course, as each of the three are varied and have different objectives and enemies, even on repeat locations, but don't expect anything too visually mind-blowing. The Lylat system is home to 5 planets, an asteroid belt, 3 sectors, and even an assault on Andross's ships. The planets are varied enough that you won't confuse any of them. The initial farming world of Corneria is a series staple at this point, and is very much the tutorial grass world of Star Fox. World 2, Titania, is a fog-covered treasure world, known for its natural resources, while World 5, Fortuna, is the prehistoric dinosaur planet, no relation, with giant flora and fauna targeted by Andross for the possibility of transforming the wildlife into living weapons. Macbeth, the 3rd planet, is a fiery and violently upheaved hollow planet where Andross's forces keep a stockpile of weapons and giant bombs stored, while the 1st planet of the Lylat system, Venom, houses Andross's base of operations on a very dirty, grimy, polluted planet. Alongside the planets are 2 asteroid fields outside of Corneria, and sectors X, Y, and Z that are a trio of nebulas that provide more free-feeling space combat with various amounts of debris and wondrous sights to break up the planet-side attacks. Course 1's direct route to Venom also features an assault on Emperor Andross's armada, and an attack on Meteor, which is more akin to an artificial asteroid base the enemy used just outside of Venom. The locations are varied enough and alternate between a default third-person ship view and cockpit modes that I never felt bored in any mission or fight. There are a few sites that made me congratulate the Super NES for rendering, and the particle effects give just enough of an illusion of speed and spaceflight that I legitimately had a fun time. It's definitely cute in the same way I view early N64 games. If your bright colors and geometric shapes are distinct enough, I can easily slip into a groove and enjoy your gameplay without hanging up too much on your simple polygon presentation. There's not much more to Star Fox beyond that. You can complete each of the 3 paths of progressing difficulty and finish the game for a high score befitting its arcade-style nature. You will eventually reach Venom and head into the planet Death Star 2-like, and eventually face Emperor Andross inside. Despite the ape-like appearances and transmissions, you actually face a human-shaped polygonal visage made of white tiles that can assault Fox with said tiles. This is but one of many floating heads with optional limbs, bosses that Nintendo likes to put in their games, but the original Star Fox, it's simply a white face. After dealing damage to its flashing eyes and dodging its attacks, Andross reveals an inner core form resembling a vanity cue. The effect is no doubt impressive for 1993, and the entire showdown is basically showing off the Super FX chip's capabilities, as evidenced by how much slowdown you have to endure while going to town on this visual spectacle. Once defeated, the Star Fox team escape Venom, and you're treated to the ending credits as well as a rare bit of voice acting. Even though Super Metroid's iconic opening line amazed a 7-year-old me, Star Fox would have still blown me away by having not just 2 lines of spoken dialogue. Not bad when voice acting was still such a novelty.
Come in, Cornelia.
This is Cornelia, Pepper speaking. Congratulations on a job well done.
Roger. I'm heading back to Cornelia.
I'm lucky enough to have gotten hold of a Super NES Classic to record this footage and play the game for the first time. And since the game is basic enough to normally be a quick review, and is clearly in the title of this video shows, I'm going the extra mile to extend this into another 2-for-1, and will now discuss its sequel, as it's unlocked in the Classic if you simply beat Stage 1 on the original game. Star Fox 2 is one of those mythical Nintendo games for me growing up. I knew about Star Fox 64 first, despite being aware that an original one existed on the SNES, but later learned from old issues of Nintendo Power that there were actually 2 games before 64, but one game was cancelled. It wouldn't be until years later during the GameCube era, when we were graced with 2 mainline Star Fox games, that the internet became a more established fixture in both gaming and entertainment as a whole. So it was in late 2005 that I learned that the upcoming Nintendo DS game, Star Fox Command, featured gameplay largely inspired by this long-lost Star Fox 2. My curiosity piqued, the power of the internet revealed years later that an unfinished prototype existed online, but being the good boy I was, I wouldn't have the chance to play that version of a game most of us were convinced would never see the light of day officially. Imagine everyone's surprise when on June 26, 2017, Nintendo announced that it was including the finished Star Fox 2 for the Super NES Classic, and releasing it officially for the first time alongside the first official re-release of the original game. At this point, you know I got excited enough to eventually get the console, especially since I couldn't nab an NES Classic the year before. While I wanted that one mainly for Nintendo fan reasons, and a cute mini box shell of a system I really enjoy, I was determined to look out for an SNES Classic for both Star Fox games alone, with 2 being the crown jewel of the collection for me as a Nintendo fan and a general preserver and semi-historical player of video games. The system itself has a pretty amazing selection of 21 games for the most part, and I'm happy Nintendo plans to release way more systems going into 2018. It's a solid piece of nostalgic hardware, and emulates some of the best 16-bit games available on the Super NES, so I hope anyone who finds at least early Star Fox curious enough from this video to want to try it out for themselves can find a classic with relative ease. Future watchers of this video will know if I am being extremely optimistic and naive at my enthusiasm that Star Fox 2 gets to be released to thousands of curious people. Thank you arguments on artificial scarcity, production complications, and do they want my money? Points that I will not address here. So let's start on the game proper. Star Fox 2 is a direct sequel to the Super NES original and picks up where its predecessor left off. Andros has returned with cybernetic enhancements and is bent on revenge after his defeat by Fox McCloud. With bigger and badder technological terrors and improved telekinetic abilities, Andros has launched a full offensive against Corneria yet again, and has captured numerous bases in the Lilat system, bent on its sole destruction. General Prepper of the Cornerian army once again issues a distress to Team Star Fox, and alongside 2 new members, take off once again to put a stop to Andros' invasion. I glossed over the characters in the original game, so I'll briefly do so now with the full cast of characters in the sequel, since many are returning players anyway. Star Fox itself consists of the main quartet of series regulars: Team Leader Fox McCloud, Ace Pilot and Hothead Falco Lombardi, seasoned veteran Peppy Hare, and jittery mechanic Slippy Toad, hilariously described in promotional materials as hard to dislike. A jab I can only assume is tongue-in-cheek to his later Star Fox 64 appearance and eventual voice acting and knack for being a not-so-good pilot. Anyways, they're joined in Star Fox 2 by 2 new female pilots drafted from the Cornerian army, the brash Lynx Miyu and the aristocratic canine Faye. Together, the player has the option to main as any of the 6 members and select a wingman they can switch between at any time outside of combat. Each of the characters have their own stats and R-Wing designs, encouraging mixing and matching or doubling down on specific boosts, and also double as a second chance if your shields are depleted during the game and you go down during a mission. There are 3 types of ships you can choose from. Fox and Falco occupy the prototype R-Wing, the all-rounder similar to the original game and is the default configuration with smart bombs. Peppy and Slippy pilot the armored R-Wing design with slower speed and charge time in exchange for added defense and the space relief special, while Miyu and Faye helm the light R-Wings, speedier crafts in both charge time and maneuverability with the trade-off of weaker shielding and access to the super shield special. With this variety at your disposal, you are then presented with the map screen. In contrast to the first game's linear trio of paths, Star Fox 2 is actually much more freeform and tactical than its first outing. I'd almost call this the Nintendo Black Sheep effect for the series, which I'll address after a quick digression. Oftentimes, especially earlier on in the series, Nintendo has a habit of making a sequel to a previously successful game and changing up the gameplay or theme, sometimes even full genre swaps. Most famously, Super Mario Bros. 2 is notably a reskinned platformer, hence the drastic gameplay changes I'll eventually address in another video. This also happened with Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, to a lesser extent in Kid Icarus Uprising, and half of some franchises are experimental in every other installment. Looking at you, Kirby. In this case, Star Fox 2 is one of those lesser examples. It doesn't completely change the core space shooting gameplay, but the presentation and basic flow were altered to be way more ambitious. Where Star Fox gave you a choice at the beginning and then gave you a straight shot towards the finish lines, Star Fox 2 is not unsimilar to a real-time strategy game, and lets you travel anywhere across the galaxy to tackle objectives in any order you please. It'd normally be the Nintendo Black Sheep here if Star Fox Adventures didn't exist, which is a different conversation for a later time. The game's main gimmick consists of protecting Corneria from total destruction. It begins at 0% and you fail if it reaches 100. I never got a complete game over from this, but I did lose Fox on my second playthrough and suffered about 2/3 of Corneria carnage when I underestimated the difficulty jump from normal to hard. Similar to the original game, Star Fox 2 treats their difficulty setting seriously, and with the shift in gameplay, it turns to quite a tense galactic semi-real-time chess game on a timer. Every move you make on the map to intercept Andross's forces allows them to move as well. Even when you intercept them for the various missions and shooting modes, time continues regardless on the map, albeit slower. This puts an amount of pressure on the player to quickly and efficiently complete your mission, while outweighing the cons of enemy movement if you tackle a more complex task, like liberating a planet by destroying reactors and fortresses, while missiles head towards Corneria. That alone may be enough to scare away certain potential players. A time limit of any kind can really stress some people out, and I totally understand that. While I love Pikmin, I have a bunch of friends who despise the time limits of the first and third games in that series, and much preferred the second, which did away with the limit altogether. Another video for another series maybe, but since gameplay sessions of Star Fox and Star Fox 2 can take anywhere from 40 minutes to a little over an hour based on my averages, it's a concentrated form of tension in any single play session. I personally enjoy time limits like this because I find it fun to manage time alongside something simple like a 3D arcade space shooter. It helps that half of the missions can take seconds, while the other half lasts 5 to 10 minutes at most, but you can't really dilly-dally if you want to keep Corneria at 0% damage. It turns into a game of destroy the ships and missiles, take out a carrier, free that planet from a warp point, warp back to take back the satellite, then take out the other missiles and cruiser, and so on and so forth. The game is doable by anyone on normal, but on hard and especially expert, a certain level of mastery is required of a player to understand how to manage their objectives and knowing when to bail from a mission to switch gears and protect Corneria from a sudden ambush. If time management wrapped around an arcade objective-based shooter sounds like a challenge you can handle, then Star Fox 2 might be up your alley. There's a certain groove that I fell into playing the sequel, and it really is a pretty big improvement in many areas. Again, I recommend beginning on normal and then ramping up to hard, since it took me 3 tries to even unlock expert mode, and that really maxes out your multitasking skills and snap judgments in dogfights. The graphics are better as a whole, namely due to the improved and charming sprite work with gibberish squeaks, barks, and croaks the characters chatter with. Constant taunting from a cyborg to Andross while transitioning into various phases of a round keeps you on your toes while injecting that dose of Nintendo charm on top of their polish. It should be noted that like the first game, Star Fox 2 can drop its frames faster than a clumsy optometrist, largely due to the ambitious enemies and situations the sequel presents you with. If you can stomach some horrendous choppy lag, you can appreciate how much you can actually accomplish this time around. Alongside a new time-based gimmick, the bigger tactical change added to the sequel is how you can change the R-Wing from its default flight mode to a new walker mode, something that technically debuted on Wii U's Star Fox Zero in 2016, but it was taken from this game originally meant for 1996. Technically speaking, it's impressive to have a player fly around shooting enemies in a space fighter around a small map, only to transform into a walker to take out a stationary enemy, step on a switch, revert back to an aircraft to fly towards an unlocked base, then change back to invade said base as a walker, shooting down corridors, all at the press of a button. It's a level of freedom that wouldn't show up again in the series until Star Fox Assault in 2005, but it's quite a neat revelation in a game that was meant to release the same year that Super Mario 64 practically rewrote the book on gaming with that Z-axis. Being on a 16-bit console with an advanced chip makes it worth the playthrough alone, even if many will see it as a test run for the feature in Zero 2 decades later. As far as controlling the walker goes, I thought it was fine. It took me a few minutes to adjust to how you need to turn using the shoulder buttons, but otherwise I actually prefer the walker to the normal R-Wing in many situations. The lasers are actually a bit stronger when on land, and with the added bonus of being able to strafe without holding down a brake button. Your shots also semi-adjust vertically to fire on objects anywhere in your immediate view, so it never became frustrating beyond keeping your target in the middle of your reticule. Or reticle. Whatever. One other change from the original is that there is no longer a boost gauge. You simply hold down the brake or boost button, and you will stop or go as long as you're pressing them. This was embarrassingly an alteration I didn't notice until my hard mode run, around the same time that I discovered that barrel rolling can in fact deflect larger laser types. I don't know, I was somehow dim-witted on this aspect of an older game that I should have known. While the frame rate can be my worst enemy for initiating one, it only became a minor issue during a specific type of boss fight, which I'll address pretty soon. Another addition that became a series staple are blaster charge shots. Replacing the boost gauge is a charge gauge. When full, a charger blaster shot can deal major damage. This is ideal for stationary enemies when storming bases, or a well-timed shot during an intense dogfight. It's a welcome addition that would be expanded upon from 64 onwards, as the risk-reward present is that the gauge resets when you take damage here. It makes for an interesting dynamic. While charge shots are satisfying to pull off, especially in the dogfights, I do tend to simply blast away with twin blasters or their upgraded form, Type B cannons, also a thing from the first game. Don't know why I forgot to mention that earlier. Oh well, I did here. Oh right, how could I forget? The biggest addition to gameplay introduced in Star Fox 2 is that you're essentially playing in all-range mode, as Star Fox 64 designated free range on a small combat area. The first game had you on rails for the entirety of the game, barring a few neat tricks that gave you the illusion of freedom in select encounters. In contrast, Star Fox 2 lets you loose on little sections of a map to not only utilize actual 3D space, but to have real dogfights instead of a more classic light gun shooting gallery of the first game. Later games would alternate between these sections as the situation permitted, but here it's mostly on you to dictate your order of carnage. It fits well with the game's increased focus on freedom, and it's fun to see how the first two SNES games made up the DNA for the first reboot. Seriously, Star Fox 64 is such a fun game, and this is kind of why I love going back and doing reviews and retrospectives like this. I love experiencing how a series evolves and experiments in this case, and seeing what the developers decided to take forward and what they left behind. It's pretty great stuff. Overall, the missions in Star Fox 2 are somewhat varied, but also repetitive. Compared to the original game, which was a linear complete the course and beat the boss at the end, every time, the sequel does have various objectives, though you'll be doing those different objectives multiple times. They range from kill everything, be they enemies or missiles, free the satellite, I'll elaborate on this soon, which is still killing everything, and defeat the boss. That can be various mechanical monstrosities, some of which are visually and technologically impressive for the time, or against the Star Wolf Wing. Now's as good a time as any to discuss Star Wolf's introduction. More known for their classic lines in Star Fox 64, the mercenary team is hired by Andross and act as real boss encounters in the form of dogfights. These tend to be the series' traditional skill check of the player in all-range mode, the classic Dark Link style of fight. Defeat an enemy with similar, if not identical, abilities to yours. These are the aforementioned tougher boss fights that were really kicking my ass before I realized that barrel rolls can actually prevent the charge shots, something I was pretty sure wasn't possible in Star Fox 64, but I don't quite remember right now. So it immediately turned around my fortune in those fights. I was more willing to risk a good game of chicken just to fire off a charge shot of my own while avoiding their occasional shots while dealing with the timing to compensate for the lag. It was a twisted sort of game, I admit, but I do enjoy the Star Wolf encounters in pretty much every subsequent title, since they can hit hard and fast on higher difficulties here. The goal of the game is to eliminate all traces of Andross's forces, then proceeding to Andross's space station to face him. Using your team of 2, you are to judge how to approach aircraft carriers that dispatch enemy ships and missiles towards Corneria, as well as planets in the Lilat system that are being used as bases that can fire interplanetary ballistic missiles that deal major cumulative damage if left unchecked. You have 2 advantages to aid in your objective. First is the Star Fox mothership, which can restore damaged shields and can warp you to any free planet in the system. The second is to help protect Corneria, the satellite defense system. It has limited capabilities that can fire upon enemies and missiles to aid you if you can time it right on the map, but it can be taken over with viruses and fire on Corneria if you can't free it fast enough. It gets pretty intense on the higher difficulties, so much so that I thought I was pretty good until it took me 3 tries on hard to unlock Expert. And then when I thought I was acing Expert, when the second phase began, my mothership got sent back to Corneria, stranding me in the middle of the map as an invasion left me going back to defend Corneria and the new foes and invasions that suddenly overwhelmed me and shot at Corneria. It was a really great feeling. A little unfair as I didn't know I could be semi-stranded like that, but it did throw me for a loop and had me scrambling to make sure I didn't get a sudden game over. I did end that run with approximately 60% damage, where I originally had 0, but the difficulty jump was worth playing to put my skills to the test, and I got a B at the end of it, so I definitely got better. The difficulty selected also alters the missions and maps, either by pumping up the amount of enemies you encounter and throwing new mini-bosses at you, or changing up how to enter fortresses, and even some different methods on activating switches. It's a nice touch, since you will be doing a bunch of the same tasks on all 3 difficulties, but the challenge does ramp up appropriately for those who want a challenge, and a little bit of variety in their game. And that covers most of what you do in Star Fox 2. Most of the locations return from the first game, so at least the environment is varied as well as it can be. From green Earth-like worlds to even underwater sections the walker can traverse with, the free-range mode allows you small 3D environments to accomplish your missions. You can defeat every enemy and look for these pepper coins, or just beeline to switches to infiltrate the forces ASAP. It's up to you as long as you fire upon the reactors. Once you clear all of Andross's forces off the map, you can then infiltrate his flying base after dealing with Wolf O'Donnell's penultimate boss fight. After dealing with a final fortress infiltration, you are up against Andross once again. He appears this time in a mask with similar optical weak points with a new laser beam barrage, with a similar core to blast at. Higher difficulties add in extra phases to the fight, resulting in what I think is meant to be a sorcerer type of form, but my game apparently kept bugging out, and mostly just displayed his cybernetic weak point eye. The weak point makes sense, but I don't know if I'm just unlucky, too close, or what have you for his face to be missing or clipping all the time. I did see this form more clearly in my expert run, with the added, later standard floating hand weak points with telekinetic attacks, but hopefully it was only bad luck on my part that I couldn't keep a solid presentation during the final fight during my hard mode runs. Once Andross is defeated, more voice acting congratulates you on your feats, and you are then given a more combined credit sequence with boss fights and triumphant music. Of course, while the music is fine in Star Fox 2, I believe its predecessor beats it pretty handily in this regard. Seriously, besides having catchy music in general, Star Fox has really awesome build-up music as you approach a boss. Listen to this.
Incoming enemy.
That's great stuff, right? Builds that tension up so well. Not that the sequel has bad music per se, it's mostly atmospheric, it just isn't as memorable. Overall, it was pretty wild to play one Super NES game I never got to play, and also to experience a never-released new SNES game in 2017. They're impressive games for the system they were made for, and while a bit janky and somewhat bare bones, especially by today's standards, Star Fox and its sequel are a fun way to experience a milestone in console gaming. As quaint as it is now, I recommend the duology to any Star Fox fan who wants to experience its origins for themselves, and anyone who enjoys 3D space shooters. The graphics may be rough and the frame rate even stuttier, but if you can adjust to it, you might find 2 very enjoyable video games you likely have never played. Thanks for watching likely the longest reviews for these original 2 Star Fox games. I probably didn't need to go this in-depth into such old games, even if one is technically a new one, but I wouldn't be doing the whole video game retrospective analysis historian thing if I didn't, right? Plus, I really did have a fun time playing them, and I felt I had to discuss their strengths and weaknesses. At the risk of giving the impression I'm doing only comparisons, these early games are short enough that I feel I can justify someone caring about these early games and remakes to have them in a combined video. Seriously, I hope anyone who finds a Super NES Classic can eventually get one. I know the NES Classic was really hard to find, but Nintendo does mean to produce a lot more SNES Minis and make more NES Minis in 2018, so hopefully future people can correct me if I'm wrong. I hope that Star Fox can gain a bit more recognition after 2016's polarizing Star Fox Zero. That's a game I keep thinking about how to go about doing. Do I review it during the Star Fox 64 retrospective alongside its 3DS remake, even though I'll need to figure out a way to capture 3DS games, since Zero is essentially a reimagining of 64, or do I judge it separately based on how differently it actually plays, which is where much of the original contention comes from? Likely separate videos, but that's a problem for future me to figure out. Anyways, the first video I did was a Metroid review on the original NES game and its Game Boy Advance remake, so you can watch that if you aren't sick of my voice by now, or long videos talking about old Nintendo games are just your bag. My next video is likely going to be a Mario retrospective on the original NES trilogy to celebrate Super Mario Odyssey's release. It's probably out by the time this video is out. I can't wait for that game. I hope you're doing great, and I'll see you next video.